There's an idea in video games, especially games criticism, called ludonarrative dissonance, that being the difference between the gameplay and the story of a game. If Nathan Drake is meant to be a lovable rogue, then why is the player able to non-stop murder everyone in their path? Surely his body count would be a major part of the story within the Uncharted series. This difference between the character that the developers created and the one the player controls is, if we believe that ludonarrative dissonance is a fair criticism, damaging to the player's experience of the story. This idea of ludonarrative dissonance was popularized by Clint Hocking in his essay on BioShock in 2007. In his essay, he discusses how the actions of getting more powerful binds the player to Ayn Rand's theory of objectivism, and thus the story of trying to help someone to save yourself goes against the selfish gameplay that the player is taking part in. However, the player can choose not to become more powerful, saving the little sisters instead of harvesting them, thus rejecting objectivism because the story has you take down Andrew Ryan. Clint argues that being able to choose to get more powerful, but not who to side with, mocks the player for ever thinking they had a choice, creating a dissonance between the gameplay and story. Personally, I can't help but think, yeah, that's the point. The whole game is a critique of Ayn Rand, so of course you have to end up killing Andrew Ryan, the man who created the society you're forced to navigate. You follow objectives and kill who the game tells you to kill, all because, to quote Ryan,
"A man chooses, a slave obeys."
We never had a choice to reject our orders because the character never had a choice, and the player went along with everything the other characters told them to do. So, clearly BioShock isn't the best example of this ludonarrative dissonance, if it exists at all, because the gameplay serves the story in such a way that they complement each other. So, to fully understand Clint's argument, as well as why ludonarrative dissonance is such a popular term, I will first dissect the term and try to figure out if it's even useful. I'll present a variety of games that do not have any kind of dissonance, and contrast that with one popular example of it in recent years. I will then conclude about how I will use this research to go forward. Ludonarrative dissonance implies that there is a separation between the gameplay and the narrative of a video game. It implies that the story stops as soon as a button is pressed, that it can only live within the realm of cutscenes and notes, whereas I believe that it is in those moments of gameplay that the narrative shines through the best. It is the mechanics, where coding meets art, that is used best as a storytelling tool, creating stories unique to video games. So, what are mechanics? Mechanics are how the player interacts with a video game, usually through a player character, moving, jumping, attacking, going through menus. Every button press or click is a mechanic, and part of the story created for the player through their gameplay experience. In his video on mechanical storytelling, the YouTuber Games and Culture explains this quite well, that the only motivation necessary for a plot is the obstruction of that motivation through the rules of the game. All a player needs to be told, or rather shown through the gameplay, is that this is your goal, this is what's stopping you, and this is how you have to get past it. To get to the end of the level, you need to defeat the enemies. You have weapons that will do that. Games don't just tell stories, they produce them as a result of their machine-like interactive qualities. And if we widen our definition of plot, it becomes clear that every game contains multitudes of micro-narratives. This is to say, if we accept that the player wanting something, directing their character to do so, and gaining a result is a micro-narrative, even if only for a few seconds long, then it becomes clear that games tell more stories, more narratives, than any other form of storytelling. There is drama in every action that Mario performs, an emotional response when you make a difficult jump, a tragedy every time you don't. It's not uncommon for the player to say "ow" when the character gets hurt. It's because the player is invested in these micro-narratives, focused on achieving their goals. They are immersed in both the plot of the game, as well as the plot that they create while playing the game. A multiplicity of story, purely because the art reacts to the player, and the player reacts to it. But there are more to mechanics as a storytelling tool than just these micro-narratives. There are, in fact, mechanical systems in games which help produce a personal, almost improvised story, lasting for hours at a time, or even throughout the whole playing experience. So ludonarrative dissonance should really be narrative-narrative dissonance, since all of the gameplay builds into the story being created through a mixture of gameplay, cutscenes, notes, music, and many other factors. The question then is, how do games tell their stories by uniting gameplay and narrative into one story?
Now do you believe me, Ranger?
What has happened to me?
You are banished from death. Cast adrift between the worlds of light and dark. Curse binds us together within the walls of Ardar.
This can be seen in 2014's Shadow of Mordor, developed by Monolith Productions. The game has you play as Talion, a ranger of the Blackgate who has merged with the spirit of Celebrimbor, making him part man and part wraith. This means that when the character dies, the player isn't met with a game over screen. Instead they respawn, and the orc that killed them not only becomes stronger, but remembers them. This is called the Nemesis system, where through defeating and being defeated by orcs, you create a unique narrative specific to your game. Getting killed by any orc, even a nameless grunt, will cause them to rise up the ranks of orc society, becoming more powerful and remembering how you fought them, bringing the gameplay and narrative together. If you exclusively attack with the bow, they might become fully resistant, meaning that the player has to find alternate means to attack, further interacting with the full breadth of game mechanics and creating more opportunities for the developing story. However, the task of getting revenge is made more difficult if an orc you thought had died instead cheated death, coming back to take revenge, forcing the player to improvise as this orc has also learned your tricks. This is expanded upon in the game's 2017 sequel, Shadow of War, where orcs can be recruited to your army and can also betray you if you mistreat them, expanding the narrative potential. All of this contributes to a narrative outside of the game's plot, one which sees your personal nemesis gain power and react to your accomplishments. In fact, for many players, they may care more about revenge against this one particular orc far more than the man Talion is after, expanding the story out of the plot and into the realm of one crafted by the player's choices and the game's reaction to them. We can see how the player, interacting with the basic mechanics of fighting, using the environment, even dying, feeds into the Nemesis system's inherent storytelling, meaning that there is little room for any kind of dissonance. In most video games, you play as one of two types of protagonist: those created by developers, or those created by players. What this means is that either you get someone who already has a personality and life view, who's going to stay the same for most of the game, or you might get a blank slate protagonist, who will probably have minimal personality, as they need to be able to fit any kind of mold, and beyond the occasional dialogue choice, doesn't let the player express their own opinions. Both of these options present difficulty in keeping the player experience and game story intertwined. There are few games that let you create an existing character from a blank slate. One that has done so successfully is 2019's Disco Elysium by Zaum. In the game, you play as a detective who's just woken up from a night of heavy drinking with amnesia and a murder case on their hands. By having the character forget every detail about the world, the player learns about it at the same time as the character, and to the degree that they are interested in as well. The skills themselves are not about how good you are at fighting, instead they are aspects of your personhood. The more you upgrade a skill, the louder its voice gets in the character's head, allowing the player to be better at skill checks, as well as lean into the options those voices present to you. Rather than creating a character at the beginning of the game, you build up the detective from the choices you make throughout, by how you talk to people and the thoughts you internalize. And these choices change how other characters react to you, making it impossible to see and do everything in one playthrough, limiting the narrative presented to the player based on how much the player engages with the mechanics. Because in truth, Disco Elysium is not a detective game about solving a murder, it's a detective game about figuring out who the player character is and why they wanted to forget their own life, letting the player revisit painful memories, the character taking physical and emotional damage as a result. In a story about loss and hope, showing the dice roll, be it success or failure, imbues that emotion into the player, creating harmony between the mechanics and the character's actions. In my own experience, I found indie developers to have the best eye for mechanical storytelling. I think the fact that they are a smaller team and have less constraints lets those games create unique gameplay and narrative experiences. For example, 2015's Undertale by Toby Fox allows the player to approach combat either by fighting the monsters or finding a passive solution. The narrative of the game completely changing tone depending on if the player seeks peace or violence, remembering the choices they've made even after resetting or uninstalling the game. Or Pathologic by Icepick Games, released in 2005, a game built with purposefully slow movement, clunky gameplay, and unfair punishing difficulty, which perfectly reflects the bleak setting and depressing story. The player has to decide if they want to do the moral thing, or gain resources which could help them live for another day. Doing so leads to the death of those around them, making future quests more difficult. It hopefully should be clear from these examples that many games manage to avoid ludonarrative dissonance because they do not see a clear difference between gameplay and narrative, one which I also don't see. But, to make it a more fair argument, let's talk about 2013's Tomb Raider by Crystal Dynamics. In the game, you play as a young Lara Croft, on her first outing, having to experience the first time she kills someone. We see her break down after killing a man in self-defense. This is an emotional moment, but isn't represented in the gameplay in any way. After that first time, Lara doesn't comment on killing again, able to take down a number of men that would make Nathan Drake proud. The same can be said with The Last of Us, another Naughty Dog game, where Ellie, the person Joel is meant to be protecting, can simply walk right in front of opponents without any consequences, or the guards of Skyrim ignoring the fact that their friend was hit by an arrow because the player was crouching. Clearly, this is a problem, and it's sadly not uncommon within the games industry. I'm not going to stand here and say all games perfectly blend gameplay and story together, but what I will say is that the term ludonarrative dissonance is not a useful term, whether by Clint or any other reviewer, because for the gameplay to be meaningful, it must also tell a story. This is not a case of two elements of games going against each other, it's two stories which are butting heads. Narrative dissonance. To imply that the gameplay is meaningful without being narrative is misleading, because as we have seen, the art reacts to the player and the player reacts to it. Each button press is an interaction between the player and the story of the whole game, creating unique micro-narratives only possible in the interactive form of video games. Going forward, I'll be using all the research I've done so far to help me create my own video game for my end-of-year project. While my game won't be as extensive or detailed as any of the games I've been talking about, I am but one man with no coding knowledge, It will serve as an outline for a game I will create more in the future. One where the way the player interacts with the gameplay tells just as much of a story as the plot of the game, where the mechanics and narrative work seamlessly together to create an engaging and interesting story.